Ο περισσότερος κόσμος θεωρεί τα μαθηματικά κάτι δυσνόητο και ίσως λίγο βαρετό, μια ήπειρο μακρινή, απροσπέλαστη από τον μέσο άνθρωπο. Η αλήθεια είναι πως τα μαθηματικά είναι παντού, καθημερινά, κάθε στιγμή, στο φως, στους ήχους, στη μουσική, στα κτίρια που ζούμε, στους υπολογιστές μας και σε όλες τις περίπλοκες ηλεκτρικές συσκευές που χρησιμοποιούμε, στον τρόπο που ταξιδεύουν τα σύννεφα στον ουρανό. Και φυσικά στον αέρα που αναπνέουμε. Σε εποχές πανδημίας αυτό μπορεί να αποδειχθεί σωτήριο. Έχετε αναρωτηθεί ποτέ πόση ώρα μπορούν να παραμείνουν οι μαθητές σε μία τάξη χωρίς να κολλήσουν αν ένας από αυτούς έχει κορονοϊό? Ή πόση ώρα μπορούν οι ασθενείς να περιμένουν με ασφάλεια στην αίθουσα αναμονής ενός νοσοκομείου? Ή πόσο ασφαλείς είμαστε όταν πηγαίνουμε στο σούπερ μάρκετ? Τα μαθηματικά μοντέλα μπορεί να δώσουν απαντήσεις σε όλα αυτά τα ερωτήματα, αφού είναι ικανά να προβλέψουν με ακρίβεια πόσο γρήγορα και με ποιον τρόπο εξαπλώνεται ο ιός σε ένα χώρο. Επόμενος ομιλητής μας, ο Griffiths, είναι καθηγητής μαθηματικών στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Οξφόρδης και σύμβουλος της Ουαλικής Κυβέρνησης για την πανδημία. Στην έρευνα που έχει οργανώσει, η ομάδα του αναπτύσσει μοντέλα που προσδιορίζουν την ποσότητα του κορονοϊού σε έναν εσωτερικό χώρο. Αυτό βοηθά να πάρουν αποφάσεις για το αν, παραδείγματος χάριν, ένας χώρος χρειάζεται περισσότερο ή λιγότερο εξαιρισμό ή αν πρέπει οι άνθρωποι που βρίσκονται μέσα σε αυτό τον χώρο να μιλούν λιγότερο. Στην ομιλία του, μπορούμε να πάρουμε τις ζωές μας πίσω με μαθηματικά. Θα μας δείξει πώς οι έξυπνες εφευρέσεις και τα μαθηματικά μοντέλα θα μπορέσουν να μας επαναφέρουν πιο γρήγορα στην κανονικότητα. Η συζήτηση θα συντονιστεί από τη Δόκτωρ Katerina Kaouri, καθηγήτρια εφαρμοσμένων μαθηματικών στο Πανεπιστήμιο Cardiff και Science Communicator.
Hello from me. I'm Katerina Kaouri, and I would like to welcome Professor Ian Griffiths. With Ian, we work closely together on the COVID-19 modeling front since the summer. Ian is a professor of industrial mathematics and the Royal Society University Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, Ian was already extremely active internationally on a range of real applications of mathematics. For example, on finding new strategies to provide clean water to the developed and developing world, improving the performance of filters in Dyson vacuum cleaners and air purifiers, finding how to make star-shaped Nestlé Cheerios, fabricating glass for bendable smartphones, providing recently in the connection of the work he's going to relate to you today, in deployment strategies for coronavirus air purifiers in collaboration with industry again. So with Ian, we are co-leading a team on COVID-19 modeling of 4 researchers, and today he's going to give a very interesting talk on how models help us reopen the world. So Ian, with this to you, and I'm muting my microphone.
Thank you, Katerina, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about the work that Katerina and I and our group have been doing on this exciting project. And this concerns how we can reopen the world using mathematics in the wake of this coronavirus that we have experienced over the last year. So I'm going to talk about some of the mathematics that we've been doing and the way in which this helps us in our efforts to reopen the world. So some of the questions that we might want to ask here are, is it safe for pupils to go back to school? And if they do return, how far apart must they sit? Must they always wear masks? How far away should the teacher be? Should they wear a mask? If I want to go out and eat dinner with my friends, how should I do this? Should we always wear masks when we approach the table or leave the table? And do we need to be further apart from other diners? And should I worry if I go outside and exercise? Do I need to make sure that I don't get too close to other runners? And can I meet in groups outdoors? And all of these questions are very important as we try to reopen the world in the wake of this coronavirus. And mathematics can help us to answer these questions, and we'll show in this talk exactly how this can help. So if we look at the transmission of coronavirus in a room, we can see it's very complicated. So what I have here is a room, and you can see that I have an air conditioning unit here that is blowing air in these blue streams here and here. And I have a variety of people sitting at tables here. And you can see that they are breathing or talking, and there are some who are standing up as well and talking. And each of those are emitting virus particles and air from their breath. And you can see that these virus particles are being spread all over the room because of the air purifier and because of the breathing in a very complicated way. So what this means is that if we want to mathematically model this and understand what's going on here, we need to simplify the problem a little bit, because this is very complicated at the moment and will be difficult to tell whether we can sit in a restaurant or not. So we need to simplify the problem, but retain the key information that tells us whether it's safe in a room or not. And that's what we're going to do here. So most mathematical models, they assume that the virus is spread uniformly throughout the room. So here is a good example of one by Jose Jimenez in Colorado. And this is an app that exists online. And you can see here that there are various dials, such as this one here, that tells you various properties about the virus in a particular area. So here it's saying I live in an area that is 0.81% infected. And you can change these dials. So I changed this to 1.21%. And these graphs down here give us indications of how long we could stay in various places, such as an indoor gathering, an energy efficient office, or a classroom lecture. And we can change other properties, such as whether I'm wearing a mask or not, and how effective that mask is. So here we've got an 80% effective mask, but we can reduce that down to 50% and see that the graphs change here. So this is a good way of getting a fast estimate for how long we can stay in various environments. But of course, this assumes that the virus is spread uniformly in that environment. And we saw on the previous slide that that's not true. The virus is concentrated near to people's mouths, and it's less concentrated away from their mouths. And the air conditioning unit is blowing this virus around. So what we want to do is develop a mathematical model that captures these variations in the virus concentration with space. So what do we need to build up our mathematical model? Well, the first piece of physics that we need are virus sources. So these are people. And you can see here, somebody on the right is sneezing, and they are emitting some virus particles here, which float around in the air. These are called aerosols. And they emit some virus particles here that are bigger droplets, and these just fall down to the floor. So they are less dangerous because they fall to the floor and become inactive. But these ones that float around are the important ones that we need to capture in our mathematical model. The next feature that we need to include is a feature of virus spreading. So you can see this. If you were to put some coloured dye into a cup of water here, just inject this, and then just sit and wait, then at a later point, it would look like this. So you would have a spreading of this dye, and eventually the coloured water would be uniformly coloured everywhere. This is called diffusion, and this happens even without a flow. So you just leave the coloured dye and it spreads out slowly with time. So we need to incorporate this so that our viruses, even if there is no airflow in the room, these viruses will slowly spread out. The third feature is the airflow in the room that's coming from the air conditioning unit. So as you saw in the first slide that I showed, this air conditioning unit, which I've drawn here, will generate a flow, which I've drawn here to generate along, down, along the bottom, and then back up and recirculating. The fourth one is the transport of virus with this airflow. So here, if I inject some virus particles, which I've drawn red here, into this airstream, then they will move with the airstream. And that's different to diffusion. Remember, diffusion is spreading with no airflow, whereas this transport is the virus particles moving with the flow of the air. And we need both of these in our mathematical model. And finally, we need the effect of air vents. So you will find these in the ceiling of your rooms, and these will suck air out. So these act as a removal of virus. And then there will be other vents in the room which blow clean air back in. So these are helping us to remove the virus. So how do we include all of these 5 features into a mathematical model that we can then solve to try to understand how we can, how long we can stay in rooms for? Well, this is the mathematical model that translates from what we just talked about. And it looks rather complicated, but I'm going to show you what each of these bits in this equation correspond to and how it is directly analogous to what I just showed you. So first of all, we've got C here, and this C represents the concentration of virus particles anywhere in the room. So that's the number of particles per meter squared as we move around the room. And this entire term, dC by dt, represents the rate of increase in the virus particles. So if somebody is breathing, then the concentration of virus particles will go up. Now, this increase in virus particles is set equal to these terms on the right-hand side. So the first one is the airflow and transport. So here, V is the velocity or the speed of the air. So we know that this airflow will change the concentration of virus sources at different places in the room because it's moving the virus around. This is the next term. This was the spreading term or the diffusion term. Remember, this one takes place even when you don't have a flow. This one is the source of viruses. So this is an infected person breathing. And notice we have a plus sign here because this corresponds to an increase in virus particles. If somebody is breathing outwards with the viruses, that will increase the concentration of virus at that position. And then finally, we have a negative sign here for ventilation. Remember, ventilation was the removal of viruses through fans in the ceiling. So this reduces the concentration of the virus. So you can see that this equation here is nothing more than the 5 points that I showed you on the previous slide. But what we can do with this equation is we can put it onto a computer and we can perform mathematical simulations for a range of different room sizes and a range of different ventilation scenarios. So this allows us to quickly work out if a room is safe, and if it isn't, how we should adjust the ventilation to make it safe. So let's see what our model can do. Well, the first thing that it can do is it can predict the virus concentration in the room. So what I've shown you here is a plan view of the room. I'm looking down from the top on the room. And in the middle here, I have a source of viruses. This is a person breathing. Now I've drawn some lines on here, and what these lines correspond to are concentrations of the virus. So anywhere along this line here, I have a concentration of 18 virus particles per square meter. And you can see that as I move closer to the virus source, for instance, on this line here, I now have 21 viruses per meter squared. And here I have 27. So as you would expect, the closer I get to the person, the higher the concentration of the virus is. But this quantifies this effect. Now this picture here is shown in the case of what's known as poor ventilation. So this is if you are in a room and all of the windows are closed and there is no air ventilation in there. Now, if we changed this to pre-pandemic recommended ventilation. So this corresponds to having some airflow in the room, and perhaps some windows that are open. You can quickly see from our plan view that now the concentration of virus sources has gone down significantly. So for roughly the same position, we've gone from 21 virus particles down to 9. So we're more than half of the virus concentration now that we have ventilation. So this is in line with government recommendations that ventilation is a good idea, but this quantifies that effect. Now we can ask the question of what happens if we start wearing masks. And this is very easy to implement in our mathematical model. It just changes the size of this term R, this breathing infection rate, this number of viruses that are emitted. And you can see here that if we're breathing, then we emit 30 virus particles per minute. If we're talking, that's 300 virus particles per minute. But here you can see that wearing a mask halves that number of virus particles per minute. But then in our mathematical simulation, everything else stays the same. So we can very quickly obtain exactly the same pictures that we had before, and it's just these numbers that will halve. So this tells us how much safer it is to be in a room. And once we know the virus concentration in the room, we can then use this to calculate the risk of infection. Because if you go to a person in the street and tell them that the virus concentration is 100 particles per square meter, it won't mean anything to them. They won't know whether that means it's safe or whether it's dangerous. So what we want to do is transform this number into a risk so that we can go up to somebody and say, you have a 50% chance of getting the virus if you stay in this room for 1 hour. And that's more meaningful for the general public. So the way in which we do this is we relate the concentration of particles that we have so far to the notion of an infectious dose. And this infectious dose is the number of virus particles that we would need to inhale in order to get infected. Now, of course, you can see that this number is not a constant. You might get some people who go into a room and they can spend a lot longer in that room and inhale more virus particles and still be okay. And then equally, there will be some people who inhale fewer particles before they get infected. So this infectious dose is just an average. It's an average probability of catching the virus. And once we have this, we can relate it to the concentration through the number of particles inhaled. So this gives us a risk of infection that is related exponentially to the time we spend in a room. So the chance of staying safe from the virus will fall exponentially the longer we occupy the room. So this is a formula that allows us to transform our contour plots that we had before that look like this from concentrations to probabilities of getting the virus. So now, if we stay for 1 hour in this room, when there is a virus source here who is talking with a mask, and we have poor ventilation, so we have windows closed, then if I stand for an hour here, then I have a 60% chance of getting the virus. If I stand for an hour here, then I have a 75% chance of getting the virus. So this quantifies it in a meaningful way. And our mathematical model allows us to explore the benefits of ventilation. So what we can do is we can now slowly change the ventilation and see how the time to get infected will change. So this tells us that the time to get infected as the ventilation is increased will go up. That's good. That tells us that opening the windows is a good thing. But also, you can see this interesting feature that if the ventilation is very low, then the time to get infected is quite high as well. And this is because if you're in a room with someone who is infected and you're on the other side of the room, then you either want lots of ventilation so that the virus is removed from the room, or you want very little ventilation so that the virus doesn't spread across the room to you. And what we see is that there's actually a worst possible ventilation level when this is doing just enough to move the virus towards you, but not enough to remove it from the room. So that's an interesting feature that we can extract from our mathematics. And our model can quickly predict safe occupancy times that we could use for restaurants or schools. So here we can tabulate this data for different types of ventilation, from very poor, to pre-pandemic recommendation of ventilation, to the pandemic updated recommendation. And this tells us how long we can safely occupy a room if somebody in that room is speaking, or if somebody in that room is just sitting quietly and breathing, and whether they're wearing a mask or whether they're not wearing a mask. So far, I've shown you a rather simple model. We had 5 pieces of information in this model that was used to develop a mathematical equation. But what else should we include if we want to make this more accurate? Well, evaporation. So as these people will speak, the size of the droplets that are coming from their mouths will shrink because of evaporation. Do we need to incorporate this into our mathematical model? Well, we don't, because this turns out that it happens very quickly, over about 30 seconds or so, and then these droplets will equilibrate to a certain size and they won't evaporate anymore. So we're interested in occupying a room for 1 or 2 hours. So evaporation that takes place over 30 seconds is fast, and we can just ignore that. The next feature is gravitational settling. Remember, I showed you to begin with that some of these droplets would fall down to the floor. So how long does this take? Well, we can determine how long these droplets will take to settle by balancing gravity, which is pulling these virus particles down, and the air resistance, which is resisting them. And this predicts a settling time of about an hour, which is exactly the same order of time as in which we would like to stay in a room. So we need to incorporate this into our mathematical model. And virus deactivation. So these viruses won't stay alive forever. And these viruses actually deactivate over approximately 1 hour. So this is another feature that we need to include in our model if we're interested in looking how long we can spend in a room, and we're interested in spending an hour or 2 in that room. So now we've developed our mathematical model, and we have lots of different features in it. Now we'd like to turn our attention to seeing how we can improve the air quality in a room to allow people to stay longer in a restaurant, or for pupils to stay longer in a classroom. Now here, we've been working with a company called Smart Separations, and they developed an air purifier that removes coronavirus from the air. And this is called Geno, and it's shown here on this table. So Geno will suck air in through the top, which has coronavirus in, and it will neutralize this, and then out of the bottom, this will blow out clean air. So this is a good way of cleaning the air in a restaurant or a classroom. But we want to know, how does this help? We want to quantify it. So we can do a computational simulation where we place a person who is infected in a room, sat next to a Geno placed on a table. And what we see here is that if this person is speaking to a person who is sat on the other side of the table, for instance, in a restaurant, and Geno here is placed on the table but switched off for the moment, we can see that these virus particles will go all the way across the table to the person on the other side. So this has a high chance of infecting the other person. But now, if we switch Geno on, we can see that these virus particles are sucked into the top of Geno, they're neutralized and then blown out of the bottom. So this person now is much safer. And we can explore the positioning of these Genos in rooms to optimize the protection of people in that room. And we've been using our mathematical models to try to understand how we can design this Geno so that it is most effective at removing the coronavirus. So in summary, what have we learned here? Well, first of all, we've seen that we can use mathematical models that incorporate the key physics that tell us how the virus transmits. We turned statements about physics into mathematical equations. The model predicts safe occupancy times, and it tells us how we can increase these by wearing masks and ventilating the room by opening windows or switching on air conditioning units. We saw that ventilation is helpful, but we need to make sure that we ventilate enough. If we have a little amount of ventilation, then that's moving the viruses closer to people's faces, and that's bad. That's worse than no ventilation at all. We saw that virus particles settle due to gravity, and that means that the floor generally has a high virus concentration. So when you're coming in, having been outdoors, and you wash your hands, it's also wise to make sure that you don't touch your shoes after you've washed your hands, because they will be quite contaminated. And then finally, we saw how we can work with industries to understand how coronavirus air purifiers remove virus from the air and help us to reopen the world and stay in restaurants and schools for longer. So thank you for listening. And now we can stop and talk and ask some questions.
Thank you, Ian. Great talk, as always. It's open for questions, so feel free to write in the chat, and Ian will be answering the questions as we go along. So we'll wait a few seconds in case any questions come in. I don't see something in the chat. So Ian, you didn't touch a lot on the work we are doing with the Welsh government. Would you like to say some things about how policymakers, for example, are at the moment taking mathematical models into account?
Yes, that's a very good question. So all of this work that we've been doing here has been funded by the Welsh government. And so we will have meetings every 2 weeks with the Welsh government to relay the information that we have found out so far, and to get feedback on whether the directions that we're taking are important. So, for example, some of the mathematical models that we've developed apply to a particular strain of coronavirus. And one of the things that the Welsh government were interested in knowing was what happens if we have another strain, for example, South African variant, Brazilian variant. How does this change things? And the good thing is, with our mathematical models, we can build that in quite easily, and then we can run our mathematical model on the computer and work out exactly how the new strains will change the predictions that we have. So there's an important interaction with the Welsh government to make sure that our mathematical modelling is tackling the key questions.
Any questions from the audience? So I'll ask the next question, I guess. So Ian, you have also been involved in RAMP, right? Rapid Assistance to Pandemic Modeling, since the beginning of the pandemic. So would you like to tell us a few things about that informing policymaking initiative in the UK?
Yes. So one of the aspects that I've been involved with the RAMP is understanding how face masks can help, and how they should be used and what kinds of face masks are important. So one of the areas in which I do a lot of research is in filtration. So how face masks and other kinds of filters will remove contaminants. So what I've been doing there is exploring the effect of face masks, and, for example, whether wearing 2 face masks is better than wearing 1, and if so, by how much. So this is guidelines that have quite recently been issued, suggesting that wearing 2 masks might be helpful. Now here, what you have to do is you have to develop a mathematical model for the 2 types of face mask, and you have to explore whether you have one face mask and then the other, or you switch them around, and if so, what types of masks should you be wearing there? And of course, you need to know how easily you can breathe as well, because it's no good if you have two face masks on that are really good for trapping the virus, but you can't breathe. So there has to be some trade-off here between ease of breathing and protection in your environment. And of course, if you are sitting in a school, then perhaps you can have a tighter face mask. But if you are going out running, then you need to breathe more freely. So you would have a face mask that allows you to breathe more easily. And of course, when you're outdoors, then it's safer to not have such a large protection of a mask. So that's some of the work that we've been doing, and exploring the flow of air through these masks and the trapping of these virus droplets and particles within the face mask structure is quite a complicated problem. So that is the work that I've been doing with the Royal Society on the RAMP activities.
Yep. That's great. And do we know about this other, I mean, recently when we did this literature review on masks, we found these other two projects in Southampton, Cardiff, and Manchester. So people are actively looking into creating the perfect mask, let's say, right? I mean, they have to understand how the mask fits to the face, and this is not an easy problem because each face is different. I also heard one of the researchers working in the Cardiff Southampton project, they said that for women, the mask should be altered as well. Or for children, I mean, of course, we've seen smaller masks for children, but it's a matter of reducing the size, but also maintaining the efficiency. Do you know anything about this, Jan, about maintaining the efficiency?
So one of the interesting things that you touched on there is the fit of the face masks. And of course, it's no good if you have a really efficient face mask itself, if all of the virus particles will escape out of the sides. So there's a trade-off really, because you want to make sure that the airflow is passing through the face mask as you inhale and as you exhale. So there really is this trade-off in that if you make this face mask impermeable to air, so for example, you just have a plastic cover, then the virus particles will just shoot out of the side, and it's not helping. So it's helping if you're standing talking to someone front on, but anybody who's standing to the side will just receive these virus particles themselves. So it's really important to make sure you get that balance between a good fit around the side, but enough breathing in and out of the mask. And that's quite difficult, as you pointed out, Katerina. So everybody's face shape is different, and it's hard to make a bespoke mask for everybody, but you could make perhaps masks for men and for women and for children, and a range of different sizes and different shapes as well.
Any questions from the audience? So I'll come back to the smart separations work we are doing, Ian. Would you like to give some more context about this industrial collaboration? Because I know that for many people, the concept of applying mathematics to business industrial problems is it's a new idea. So maybe you can explain a bit more how we work with this company.
Yes. So we made contact with this company, Smart Separations, over 2 years ago now at what's called a study group. So these are week-long meetings where companies will come along and they will present a problem that they are encountering in their work.
So it was a studying group in Cyprus, right?
Yes. Yes. And in this case, so Smart Separation brought along a problem to a study group in Cyprus. And here they wanted to just understand how they could better optimize their filters that they designed. So they designed some filters that had a special pore structure, but they weren't sure how these filters were actually working. So we developed some mathematical models to understand how particles would weave their way through these filters that they manufactured. And from that, they then developed a smart coating, which is a biocide. And this is the thing that removes the coronavirus from the air. So they would coat the filters that they'd already manufactured with this biocide so that as particles with virus in them work their way through the filter, that if they touched on the side of this filter, they would be neutralized. And so here we had to establish a dialogue with the company, Smart Separations, to understand how much, how effective this biocide was. So for instance, if a particle touches onto the surface, how long does it need to touch on that surface before it's neutralized? So here we had to work on a microscale model that was looking at the viruses wiggling their way through the filter. And then on the macro scale, which was telling us how the air was flowing into this filter. So that was the first part of the discussion with Smart Separations. And the second part was understanding how we design this filter, this Geno, as they had called it. So you saw that the air is sucked into the top of Geno and neutralized and then blown out of the bottom. But one of the things that you have to be careful with this is that the exhaust at the bottom doesn't blow the virus sources that are being sucked in. So if the exhaust is too close to the virus sources as they're sucked in at the top, then this could actually have detrimental effects and blow the virus around. So this is something that our mathematical models are able to inform, is how we should design the filter so that the exhaust and the intake are located suitably far apart so that you don't have this agitation of the virus-laden air. And again, like with the Welsh Government, there is a dialogue that's continually taking place between our group and with Smart Separations to make sure that we are understanding how our mathematics can help.
Indeed, it's a dialogue that needs a lot of good listening skills, isn't it? Because you want to understand how non-mathematicians think about problems and then translate it to mathematics and then explain back to them what you understood from the maths. So I find this very interesting. I know you do also, Ian. And it's good that we're working with this company. I have one question here in the chat. And do we have a model solution for reopening classes, and then why don't government opens them? I would just say that actually our case study here that of the model, the first case study we looked at in this model that Ian presented was on classrooms, and it's a lot of work on classrooms and whether we can reopen classrooms. So Ian, would you like to comment as well?
Yes. So as Katerina says, the main objective of our work in the early days was to understand how we could reopen classrooms. Now, of course, I showed you a picture to begin with that was a three-dimensional picture where we had virus particles swirling around an air conditioning unit, and you can see that that's very complicated. Then I showed you a web-based tool that assumed that this virus was spread out everywhere. Now, our mathematical model is somewhere in between there. So it assumes that we have spatial variations in our virus concentration, but it doesn't track all of the full three-dimensionality of the problem. So at the moment, what we are carefully doing is looking at our predictions for how long pupils could stay in a classroom and comparing this with data that is available in the literature. Because one of the things that we must be careful with these mathematical models is making sure that we have captured all of the right physics before we can use this as a deployment strategy that can advise the government. So at the moment, we're at the stage where we are testing this information to see how safe it is and how reliable it is. But this takes time and it takes iteration with the government. So that's why at the moment there isn't guidelines that are hard and fast that can be rolled out. I hope that answers the question.
Indeed, and and then with each country doing their own thing, isn't it? In a sense, like in the UK, all students went back to school on March 8th, In Cyprus, where I'm from, many students are still not in school. They are doing online education, and each country is at the moment not relying on mathematical models, I would say. I don't know one country where at the moment they use the mathematical models to decide, but there are many activities, and is bound to be used very soon, I feel. Ian, what do you think?
Yes, I think so. I think that over the course of this pandemic, I think many people have come to realize the importance of mathematical models to understand how this virus spreads. And I think that slowly these mathematical models are becoming a part of a government strategy for taking approaches. But these kinds of changes, so these are large-scale changes, take time. And so trust needs to be secured, and we need to be able to demonstrate successes on small scales before we can upscale, because we have to be very careful about whether we can transfer the knowledge that we have here to other places, such as a large-scale lecture theatre, for instance.
Yep, room size is very important, as we saw in the models, isn't it?
Yeah, precisely.
I mean, changing from one location to the other, just to add to what Ian said, it's you have to rerun the model, right? So you have to customize the model in each location, basically. And we recently had this meeting with the lead ventilation expert in the UK, Professor Noakes. She said every room is different. And this explains why people and governments are very uncertain about reopening their particular locations, I think.
Yes,
it's very uncertain.
Yes, yeah, it really is. And one of the things that we've been testing out a little bit is the development of an app that we can try different rooms with. So just as a quick slide, so here is a app in its current form. So you can see that you have a lot of different variations, such as room length, room width, that you can change around here. And then these will update on the app, and this will give you predictions of how safe it is in a room at different locations. But these are things that need to be tested and thoroughly tested. And at the moment, we're talking with experimentalists as well, who may be able to test the spread of virus sources in a room in a controlled environment, rather than in a school where it's a little bit less controlled.
Yes. I see many questions from the audience, 4. So let's take them one by one, Ian, but it's good to know that there are 4 so that we manage the time, because we need to finish 10:02. Yeah. So we have 8 minutes. So the first one is, could the architecture structure of Gino help the spreading of coronavirus in circular table, for example, and could it be modified just with accessories in order to improve its efficacy?
That's a really good question. Yeah. So
very good. Yes, indeed.
Yes. How should you change the shape of Gino according to the table that you're sat on? And yes, I that's something that mathematics really could help us with. And as a naive guest, you might imagine that the shape of Gino would mimic the shape of the table. So if you sat at a circular table, you would have a circular Gino that is pushing air out radially in all directions. Whereas if you have a table where you're sat opposite one another, then perhaps you would like the air to blow out perpendicularly so that it's not blowing into the faces of the diners. So that's an excellent question, and one that we may actually take back to smart separations and discuss.
Yes, I think they are interested in how the Gino is laid out in the room. So such questions are very important. And we're also thinking about the holistic design of rooms and buildings going through the next phase of the pandemic. Yeah. So that also relates what accessories you put in the room, what are the obstacles in the room, what is the structure of the room. So I will go to the next question, though. As a professor, do you think universities must stay closed? I'm also academic in Cardiff, and I also have an opinion. But Ian, would you like to say your opinion?
So as a university, we are coming close to the end of our academic year. So and in the next term, it'll be principally exams. which will be open book now anyway, because they've been designed that way. So I think a sensible strategy would be that the university stay closed for the coming term, because we are set to do that. And then that will allow us to reopen in the new term in September or in October, which will give us those extra months to allow things to settle down again.
Yeah, I mean, the universities are not closed, I would say, right? And just to clarify, they are doing, you mean, I guess, whoever asked this question, tele-education.
Yeah.
And it's been discussed actually even for the next months when the new semester opens, at least in Cardiff, about a hybrid mode. So we'll see how things evolve. I mean, one thing that we have to say is that people should trust that the education officials don't really want to put their students at risk, right? So there's a big responsibility there. Anyway, next question. Is there any model in regards open air spaces, and does the mask help in open air? There is just one model, I said that because I did a recent literature review, just one model, but very sparse information on masks in open air, at least with the mathematical models. So one thing that we did hear from a talk of Professor Stone in Princeton at one point in January was that if you are too close, even outdoors, to somebody, then it's like you are indoors. So I took this insight away for our work as well. So it's not like indoor, outdoors, and outdoors is much better. It depends where you are outdoors as well. But there is no consensus at the moment. Next question for Ian. The model seems to predict that very low, parenthesis, zero ventilation, parenthesis, upwards curve at zero. So why do we need to have ventilation at all?
Yes, that's a good question. So the amount of ventilation on the picture that I've shown with this upward trajectory was so minimal, it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to achieve this in a room. So you would only need, for instance, somebody to turn a page of a newspaper, and that would generate a ventilation that would push you away from that upward trajectory. So in principle, it is achievable, but in practice, it is almost impossible, because you have movement in that room. So it's not an achievable area. But it does just need to just raise the point that you need to be careful that if you ventilate, you just want to make sure that you ventilate enough.
Thank you, Ian. Next question. After the vaccine, will it be better for education based on mathematical models? I'm not sure I quite understand this. So I guess the question is about the modeling, or is it about education? But it's just after the vaccine, what happens?
So if it's in terms of what the education should be focused on, and whether we should be focusing on mathematical modeling of things like this, then I think certainly it should become more of a focus. And I think there are a lot of, for example, mathematical epidemiologists now who are focusing on exactly these kinds of questions. So this will propagate down into the education.
Yes, I think they did a study in the US early on, before the deployment of vaccine, about how many months will take to vaccinate, and then how much immunity will be built progressively in the population. And this, of course, you can then relate to how many hospital resources you need. So there are all these sorts of vaccine-related modeling that people have started doing, if that's a question. There was something with education we don't understand, but I'll move to the next question. Is there a way to account for people not using masks properly?
Yes, there is. So we can mathematical model whether a person is wearing a mask just over their mouth, but not their nose, whether they're wearing it over their nose, not their mouth, whether the mask is ejecting from the side virus particles. And we can capture all of those with mathematical model, where we're modeling the actual interaction of the air on the face, and then that would build into the mathematical model that I've shown you here, which predicts safe occupancy times. So yes, you absolutely can account for wearing masks incorrectly.
Indeed. And then there's a long question. I'm gonna do the above. I'm gonna read the first part, because there are two questions in one. How can we take into account the biological differences between people, age, health issues when we create the mathematical model? Ian, can I answer this?
Yes.
You talked about the infectious dose, and we said also about the probability of infection. So the way we take into account the differences between people is this probability to be infected, right? So it's 50% we put it in the model now. So this means that not everybody is the same. So that's why we talk about probabilities. Ian, would you like to add anything about this?
No, I think that's answered it well, that we have an area in our mathematical model that can account for the susceptibility of individuals.
So we do have that in the mathematical model in a nutshell. And then there is another long question. Also, could mathematical models change depending on cultural identity of a society? How can that be modelized and studied? Interesting. I understand that the model can be updated with new data that we collect in physics, biology, epidemiology, etc. Indeed. How do all these scientists and researchers communicate effectively? Where are we? Communicate effectively. Well, okay, I'll stop there. Ian, would you like to say how we communicate with all these different disciplines, which has been a challenge, actually?
Yes, it really has been. I think this has been a good example of how lots of different scientific communities can unify to address a common cause. And I think in the early days, it was quite difficult. So you would find this in the sense of some people working on one thing and other people working on another and not talking to one another, perhaps because they weren't aware of this. And I think that over the course of this last year, lots of groups have emerged where we have this common framework that we will talk over, such as these government meetings that we have. So we will have lots of people from different scientific disciplines all bringing their thoughts to the mix so that this unifies our ideas and makes them stronger as a whole. But it's a good question.
Yes, and it's been very intensive. I mean, as leaders of this team of researchers that you see here in the slide, we have to organize all these meetings all the time with different disciplines to be informed. And also in the same question, I see you're asking about literature review. Indeed, the other parallel process we have to do is continuously scan the literature to see if there are new information. But the good thing with working with the government is that they have contacts with everybody, all universities in the Wales especially, but also the wider UK. And then you can get also information that has not been published, because the COVID-19 research is very fast, is evolving very fast. So it's good to have direct access to people that are actually doing the research before they get it out there. So we've been trying to get all this information as fast as possible. It's been a whirlwind journey, but a very interesting one. Let me see if there is anything else. So we have to close the discussion now. Thank you very much all for being here. The chat questions really picked up after a point. So Ian, I guess you are available and I'm available if you have more questions. Feel free to find us from our university websites and email us to get more information.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So thank you all.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.